Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back, all the way to the late Ptolemaic period in Egypt. I know it's late, so settle in. Dim the lights, fluff up your pillows, maybe take a slow sip of something warm. Tonight, we're wandering through stone corridors, dusty sarcophagi, and the surprisingly melodramatic lives of the rulers of the Nile, particularly the famous, or infamous, Cleopatra and her long line of royal relatives. Imagine, if you will, a world where dynasties spent generations trying to keep their bloodlines pure, a pursuit that, ironically, often left them weak, sickly, or just utterly bizarre. And Cleopatra, she may be the most famous name, but she was surrounded by a cast of relatives who make reality TV families look moderately sensible. Cleopatra VII, the one everyone remembers, lived at a time when the Ptolemies had been ruling Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. They were Greeks, but they ruled Egypt with all the pomp and mystique expected of pharaohs. And naturally, the Ptolemies liked to keep things in the family. Incestuous marriages were common, not scandalous, just practical. If you're thinking, that sounds like a terrible idea, congratulations, you're catching on slowly. Cleopatra's early life was a mix of privilege and political tension. She was the daughter of Ptolemy XII Auletes, nicknamed the flute player, mostly because he apparently enjoyed fluting more than ruling. Or perhaps it was the other way around, we're not entirely sure. Her father was obsessed with the optics of power, which in practice meant trying to buy Roman support while keeping his own family in line, which, as you might imagine, was a challenge. Cleopatra herself was intelligent, famously multilingual, and probably extraordinarily good at playing the political game. But like the rest of her family, she grew up surrounded by chaos. Her siblings, yes, her siblings, would become both her co-rulers and her rivals. The Ptolemies had this charming habit of marrying within the family, so Cleopatra eventually wed her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. They were technically husband and wife, which feels uncomfortable to think about. But again, history is often just a catalog of uncomfortable situations. And yet, this was not a household lacking in drama. Cleopatra's early reign involved exile, plots to regain power, and a carefully cultivated image of divine favor. She wasn't the kind of ruler who spent her time on banal tasks. She needed to survive. And survival meant navigating sibling rivalries, Roman politics, and an ever-present threat that the wrong banquet or the wrong smile could end her reign or her life. Now, let's drift over to the tombs themselves, because this is where history gets quietly, unsettlingly fascinating. Cleopatra's burial place has never been definitively located, but there are accounts, mostly from later historians, suggesting that some of the Ptolemies' burial customs involved unusual forms of mummification. Some mummies were painted in vivid colors, perhaps to symbolize vitality, or to preserve an illusion of life. Some reports even suggest that certain royal bodies were treated in ways that, to modernize, seem macabre. Applied pigments while the bodies were still warm, ritualized preservation that merged art with mortality. It's tempting to imagine Cleopatra herself, surrounded by treasures, gold, and painted attendants, lying in a chamber filled with the scent of resins and incense. And beside her, perhaps, her relatives, who had passed through similar rituals, each reflecting the quirks and obsessions of a family that adored its own reflection in the Nile a little too much. Her personal life was no less dramatic. She famously had relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, partly romantic, mostly strategic. She understood optics. Caesar, the seasoned general, was smitten, but Cleopatra knew how to use charm as currency. Antony, on the other hand, was drawn into Egypt's politics in ways that would have disastrous consequences for both him and her kingdom. Their union was a blend of political alliance, personal attraction, and mutual survival instincts. Both of them were casting about for a way to win, and that always makes for good drama.
Cleopatra was also known for her intelligence, and not just the sort that helps you memorize names and dates. She spoke multiple languages fluently and was deeply involved in governing, personally managing grain shipments, naval operations, and diplomatic negotiations. But, as with many royals, intelligence didn't protect her family from the cumulative effects of inbreeding. The Ptolemaic line had a reputation for health problems, fragile constitutions, mysterious illnesses, and a susceptibility to untimely death. Cleopatra's own family members often suffered early, dramatic ends, making her one of the few survivors of her generation. As we drift through these corridors of history, it's easy to imagine the daily life in Alexandria. Ornate palaces, the constant hum of court officials, advisors whispering in corridors, and Cleopatra herself navigating all of it with a calm, measured intensity. And yet, beneath the surface, there was tension, petty disputes, and sibling rivalries simmering just beneath the layers of gold and marble. It's a world where every smile could be calculated, every favor had strings attached, and every feast was as much a political maneuver as it was a meal. One of the more peculiar aspects of Cleopatra's legacy is how much emphasis was placed on appearances. Coins depicted her with idealized features, statues reinforced her divine status, and visitors to the court were treated to spectacles designed to impress and intimidate simultaneously. She understood the power of image, a skill that would make her one of the most famous rulers in recorded history. And yet, behind the public persona, the family dysfunction, fragile health, and political danger remained constant companions. Even the mummification practices themselves tell a story. Imagine the artisans carefully painting each layer of linen, applying oils, wrapping limbs in precise patterns, all while adhering to rituals that blended superstition, art, and control. For a dynasty obsessed with bloodlines and legacy, the tombs became a final statement of identity, a way of preserving a version of life that history could later marvel at or quietly judge. In Cleopatra's case, the tomb is as much myth as history. Some claim it lies beneath a temple at Topasiris Magna, others argue it was lost to the sands. But what matters more than the exact location is the glimpse it gives us into the mindset of the Ptolemies. Obsession with lineage, the mingling of the theatrical and the fatal, and a very human desire to leave a mark even in a world that often treated life and death with the same casual hand. So as we slowly drift along these ancient sands, imagine the delicate balance Cleopatra maintained. A queen in a male-dominated world, a sibling navigating rivalries, a strategist using charm as her weapon, and a figure enveloped in both the history she made and the myths that would follow her for centuries. It's a quiet, somber story, punctuated with small ironies: the painted mummies, the fragile dynasty, the brother she married, and the empire she fought to protect. And now let's drift over to the next royal curiosity: the slightly less famous but equally peculiar members of the Ptolemaic family, whose lives were a tangle of ambition, eccentricity, and unfortunate health issues. There's Ptolemy XIV, Cleopatra's younger brother and co-ruler, whose reign is mostly remembered for its brevity and for being overshadowed by her sister's brilliance. He was often sickly, frequently sidelined, and eventually met an untimely end, under circumstances historians can only vaguely reconstruct, which is a polite way of saying it probably involved poison. We'll wander through his life gently. Small details, quiet observations, the sort of things that help us imagine not just the events of history, but the human texture of it. Late-night counsels, whispered advice, the weight of expectation pressing on a fragile body. It's not dramatic in a cinematic sense, but it's fascinating in the slow, almost hypnotic way that real history can be.
Cleopatra's siblings and the tangled web of Ptolemaic eccentricities. So, as we continue through the quietly chaotic halls of the Ptolemaic dynasty, let's turn our attention to Cleopatra's siblings. Because, of course, one cannot fully appreciate Cleopatra's brilliance without imagining the rather odd individuals she had for brothers and sisters. The Ptolemies were nothing if not an example of the perils of dynastic obsession. Take Ptolemy XIII, her first co-ruler, and technically her husband. He became king at a very young age, and from all accounts he was moody, easily influenced, and prone to fits of petulance. You can picture him, perhaps sitting on a throne that was far too big, scowling at advisors while plotting to outmaneuver a sister who was cleverer, older, and infinitely more politically aware. He was the kind of young ruler whose life could be summed up as trying and failing to impress the people who actually ran the kingdom. Their co-rule was rocky, not surprisingly. Cleopatra was forced into exile at one point, fleeing to Syria to gather support, leaving her brother in Alexandria, where he promptly made things worse, as you might expect. In historical terms, Ptolemy XIII had the unique ability to transform a politically delicate situation into absolute chaos, and naturally, he did so with remarkable efficiency. He eventually returned with an army, intending to reclaim his throne, but Cleopatra had already secured Julius Caesar's attention and, more importantly, his resources. So when the two forces met outside Alexandria, it was a family feud with world-altering consequences. Ptolemy XIII's end came during this conflict. He drowned in the Nile, either accidentally or by design. The records are vague, which is historians' polite way of admitting, well, we're not sure, but it probably wasn't good for him. Next, there's Ptolemy XIV, Cleopatra's younger brother, who became co-ruler after Ptolemy XIII's untimely demise. He was barely more than a child, and by this point, Cleopatra had firmly established herself as the dominant figure in the family and the kingdom. Ptolemy XIV's role in history can mostly be summarized as exists, nominally rules, overshadowed by Cleopatra. Eventually, he too met an early death, likely orchestrated by Cleopatra herself to consolidate her power. Again, history is quiet on the details: mysterious illnesses, unexpected fevers, suspicious timing, but it's tempting to imagine the royal court quietly noting, well, that's convenient. And then there were Cleopatra's sisters, including Arsinoe IV. Arsinoe had her own dramatic arc. She was spirited, ambitious, and naturally a thorn in Cleopatra's side. During the Alexandrian Civil War, she declared herself queen in opposition to Cleopatra. She wasn't merely a footnote. Arsinoe had an army, supporters, and a flair for political theater. But like most family members opposing Cleopatra, her ultimate fate was grim. After Caesar's intervention, she was exiled and eventually executed. It's a recurring theme. The Ptolemies were brilliant at creating tension within their own family. Each sibling was a potential rival, each marriage a potential disaster, each succession a precarious balancing act. And it was all dressed up in the ceremonial pomp of Alexandria, with golden thrones, lavish banquets, and statues that screamed, politely but insistently,
Look at us. We are important. Let's not forget Ptolemy 15, the child of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, more famously known as Caesarion. He was born into extraordinary circumstances, an heir to both the Egyptian throne and, in theory, a connection to Rome's most famous figure. Caesarion's life, however, was quietly doomed from the start. The Romans were not particularly interested in a child who might claim power in both worlds, and by the time Cleopatra was gone, Caesarion's fate was sealed. History records it tersely. He was executed. It's a pattern in the Ptolemaic family, isn't it? Fragile bodies, fragile alliances, and a persistent sense that each family member was both indispensable and utterly expendable. And yet, for all the intrigue, the day-to-day life of Alexandria's royal court must have had its quieter moments, late evenings spent in libraries or gardens, whispered conversations about strategy, and Cleopatra herself practicing the arts of negotiation, diplomacy, and charm. There is also the matter of inbreeding, which, let's be honest, was rampant. The Ptolemies repeatedly married within the family, a habit intended to preserve Greek heritage and legitimacy. The result was a lineage increasingly prone to health problems, unusual traits, and in some cases mental instability. Cleopatra herself appears to have been unusually robust by comparison, though certainly not immune to the consequences of generations of genetic narrowness. Her siblings and children often suffered chronic illnesses, untimely deaths, or physical frailty. This raises a quiet, almost poetic observation. For all the gold, all the power, and all the elaborate rituals, the Ptolemaic dynasty could not escape the slow, inexorable realities of the human body. And maybe that's part of what makes their story so mesmerizing. In life, they wielded immense authority. In death, they were wrapped in linen, painted, preserved, and remembered. Speaking of painted, preserved, and remembered, we might drift for a moment back to the tombs and funerary practices. Some historians speculate that mummies were sometimes colored in bright pigments, a practice that may have seemed intended to capture life itself. Imagine artisans moving with meticulous care, painting the body of a queen or prince in hues meant to symbolize eternity, vitality, and divinity. Some reports even suggest that pigments were applied while the body was still warm, an odd mix of reverence and ritualized control over life and death. It's almost comforting in a strange way. Even as these individuals were vulnerable, as dynastic machinations played out and mortality circled ever closer, there was a human desire to hold on to identity, to project permanence, and perhaps to impress the afterlife. Cleopatra herself, as far as we can tell, would have understood the symbolism, the theater, and the psychology of it all. She was, after all, the master of appearances. Now, as we continue our slow drift through this history, we should pause on one final detail about the Ptolemies, their penchant for ritualized drama. Every coronation, every funeral, every diplomatic meeting was an opportunity to reinforce authority and demonstrate divine favor. Yet, behind the spectacle, there were human concerns, sibling rivalries, illness, mistrust, and occasional opportunistic poisoning. Life at court was, by turns, tedious in a terrifying way, and occasionally just enough fun to make it bearable. Cleopatra navigated all of this with remarkable skill. She managed to survive the internal intrigues, the external threats, and the health crises that seemed to plague her family. And while much of her life is remembered in flashes of romance, political alliance, and tragic endings, the quieter, more subtle aspects, her intellect, her strategic patience, her management of an often capricious court, remain equally fascinating. And so, as we drift into the later years of her life, we can imagine Alexandria as Cleopatra knew it, a city of shimmering palaces, bustling markets, and the constant undercurrent of danger and intrigue. Each day was a balancing act, each decision a careful calculation, and through it all, Cleopatra remained a figure of poise, intelligence, and an almost eerie calm in the face of family chaos and political peril. Next, we will wander further into her extended family and the broader consequences of Ptolemaic inbreeding, exploring the lives of more distant cousins and relatives whose peculiar habits and fragile constitutions made the dynasty both fascinating and tragically doomed.
The extended Ptolemaic family, dynastic oddities and quiet tragedies. Now, as we continue our gentle journey through the Ptolemaic dynasty, let's consider the extended family, the cousins, aunts, uncles, and distant siblings who, while less famous than Cleopatra, add layers of quiet absurdity and tragic irony to the story. Because in the Ptolemaic world, being royal was less about safety and more about maintaining a complex web of fragile alliances, mostly within your own family. Take Cleopatra's elder relatives, for instance. Ptolemy IX, nicknamed Lathyrus, or the Lame, had a reign riddled with misfortune, family intrigue, and a stubborn tendency to escape Alexandria when things got difficult. He married his own sister, Cleopatra IV, naturally, because marrying outside the family was apparently a scandalous idea. Their union was not exactly harmonious. There were plots, exiles, and the kind of slow-moving family drama that probably made even the cats of Alexandria sigh in frustration. Ptolemy IX himself was known for mood swings, temperamental outbursts, and occasional bouts of indecision, which, in the life of a ruler, is politely described as political instability. His decisions often exacerbated conflicts with his siblings, creating a cascade of tension that would ripple through generations. One can picture him in the royal gardens, muttering to himself about coups, betrayals, and the perils of having a sister who was more competent than he was. Then there were his sisters, several of whom married brothers or cousins, producing children whose fragile constitutions reflect a dynasty obsessed with purity. It's not particularly surprising that many of these young royals suffered from chronic illness, early death, or unpredictable behavioral quirks. The Ptolemies were in effect running a natural experiment in inbreeding, one that had all the sophistication of a laboratory experiment conducted by people who were more interested in appearances than in actual outcomes. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of, these genetic misadventures, Alexandria remained a hub of culture, scholarship, and political maneuvering. The city's libraries, temples, and theaters offered a kind of civilized backdrop to lives otherwise filled with scheming, rivalry, and the quiet anxiety of fragile bodies and ambitious minds. One can imagine Cleopatra herself, in her later years, walking through these spaces, aware of both the beauty of her surroundings and the precariousness of her family's fortunes. Let's drift over now to the oddities of royal childhoods. Many Ptolemaic children were raised with intense formality, tutored in philosophy, language, and diplomacy. But their lives were also punctuated by the peculiar pressures of inbreeding, fragile health, and constant political threat. Children like Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, were born into immense privilege, but also into a world where survival was uncertain and every relative was potentially a rival or threat. The royal nursery, if one can call it that, was a place of learning, politeness, and quiet anxiety, a space where even minor illness could become a political problem. It's worth noting that these patterns were not unique to Cleopatra's immediate family. Across the Ptolemaic line, we see repeated cycles of brief reigns, early deaths, and sibling rivalries. There's Ptolemy XI, for example, who had a famously brief and disastrous tenure as king.
He married his stepmother, Arsinoe III, because, again, why not? And his reign ended almost immediately with her murder. Some historians describe this period as a series of unfortunate events, but that might be underselling it. It was in reality a slow-motion tragedy punctuated by petty ambition and family betrayal. And then there's Ptolemy XII himself, Cleopatra's father, who earned the nickname Auletes, or the flute player, due to his predilection for music over administration. He spent much of his reign trying to balance Roman interests with domestic stability, a task made infinitely complicated by an extended family that seemed to delight in creating crises. One can imagine him, flute in hand, pondering exile, bribes, and the occasional palace coup, quietly wishing that his family were less complicated. The pattern becomes almost hypnotic when we look at the broader Ptolemaic dynasty. Each generation seems to repeat the mistakes of the previous one: sibling marriages, fragile heirs, ill-advised alliances, and the constant hum of potential disaster just behind the palace walls. And yet, there's a strange poetry to it. The family, in all its dysfunction, created a civilization that was culturally vibrant, politically intricate, and endlessly fascinating to historians. As we drift further, we can consider the quieter moments. Cleopatra negotiating grain shipments to Rome, her siblings plotting quietly in the shadows, artisans supplying final layers of paint to royal mummies, and children learning the precarious etiquette of court life. These small, seemingly mundane details offer glimpses into a world where power was constant, peril was ever present, and survival often depended more on wit and adaptability than on strength or wealth. And so, as the Ptolemaic line continued to navigate these complexities, the patterns repeated themselves. Siblings married siblings, rulers were dethroned by relatives, and heirs were sickly or untimely. Cleopatra's brilliance, her charm, and her survival stand out all the more because of the steady, quiet chaos surrounding her. She was, in essence, the calm in a family storm that never quite subsided. We might also note softly that while Cleopatra's public image has been romanticized over centuries, the reality of her life was far more mundane in some respects and profoundly precarious in others. Daily governance, diplomacy, and survival required constant attention, careful planning, and a keen understanding of human behavior. Every smile could be a strategy, every alliance a trap, and every family member could be a potential rival or threat. And in the end, these subtleties, rather than battles or spectacular acts of heroism, define the Ptolemaic story for those willing to listen quietly. It is a story of intelligence, cunning, human fragility, and the sometimes absurd ways in which a dynasty sought to maintain control over both life and legacy. Next, we will drift gently into the final years of Cleopatra's life, examining her strategic choices, her alliances with Rome, and the subtle interplay between personal ambition and dynastic necessity. We'll consider how, even in her final days, the echoes of family eccentricity, sibling rivalry, and the consequences of inbreeding quietly shaped events around her.
Cleopatra's final years: power, Rome, and quiet tragedy. As we continue our slow wander through history, let's drift into Cleopatra's later years. She was no longer merely a clever, ambitious young queen. By this point, she had become a seasoned ruler, acutely aware of the precariousness of her position. Every decision she made carried weight, sometimes the weight of life and death, sometimes the weight of her dynasty's legacy. Her alliance with Julius Caesar had stabilized her reign temporarily, but Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE threw the Mediterranean world into chaos. Cleopatra, ever attentive to both optics and opportunity, recognized the necessity of new alliances. Enter Mark Antony, Roman triumvir, and, as history would have it, Cleopatra's next great consort. Their relationship was as much political as it was personal, a delicate dance of strategy, charm, and subtle negotiation. Alexandria, at this time, must have been a city of contrasts: palaces gleaming in the sun, bustling marketplaces, scholars debating in the streets, and beneath it all, the quiet tension of a ruler balancing multiple threats. Antony was captivated by Cleopatra's intelligence, political acumen, and poise. She, in turn, navigated Roman politics with an almost hypnotic skill, ensuring that Egypt remained independent, or at least as independent as one could hope when the Roman juggernaut loomed. And yet, even in these moments of apparent power, the echoes of her family's dysfunction and fragility were never far away. Her siblings had long since been removed from the game, either dead, exiled, or otherwise neutralized, but the Ptolemaic patterns persisted. The consequences of generations of inbreeding, early deaths, and fragile health were evident in her extended family and in the delicate line of succession. Caesarion, her son, carried the weight of both her legacy and the looming threat of Rome. His survival was uncertain, as any heir in such circumstances would know. There's something quietly ironic about Cleopatra's position. She wielded immense influence, commanded loyalty, and captivated some of the most powerful men of the age, yet her life was threaded through with fragility. A single misstep, a single shift in allegiance could undo everything she had carefully built. And in many ways, that fragility was mirrored in the broader dynasty. The Ptolemies, despite centuries of rule, were a family that had repeatedly teetered on the edge of collapse. Cleopatra, as brilliant as she was, could not entirely escape that inherited instability. Her final years were marked by both brilliance and melancholy. She arranged naval and military campaigns alongside Antony, orchestrated lavish ceremonies, and continued to present herself as a divine ruler, the embodiment of Isis herself. Yet even amid the pageantry, there were quiet moments of tension, whispers in the halls, the constant pressure of Rome, the precarious health of her household, and the knowledge that her dynasty's future rested on slender, uncertain threads. And then came the fateful confrontation with Octavian, Rome's rising power. Antony's forces and Cleopatra's influence could not withstand the sheer momentum of Roman determination. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE was decisive. Antony's fleet was defeated, and Alexandria was left exposed, vulnerable, and, for Cleopatra, a city on the brink of profound change. It's tempting to imagine Cleopatra at this moment, not as the grand figure depicted in countless histories and dramas, but as a person quietly assessing her options. Her life had been a careful orchestration of intelligence, charm, and strategic calculation. Now, faced with the collapse of her carefully constructed world, she acted in accordance with the subtle pragmatism that had defined her reign. Historical accounts suggest that when Octavian entered Alexandria, Cleopatra sought to preserve as much of her dignity, power, and family legacy as possible. She arranged her affairs, ensured that her son's status was acknowledged, and when the inevitable end came, did so in a manner consistent with her lifelong understanding of symbolism, ceremony, and control. The method of her death, traditionally described as self-administered venom, was quiet, deliberate, and in a way emblematic of her life, a final assertion of autonomy amid circumstances largely beyond her control. And yet, even here the patterns of her family echoed. Caesarion was killed, following the cruel arithmetic of political necessity. The dynasty that had survived generations of fragile heirs, sibling rivalries, and inbreeding finally succumbed to the pressures of the wider world. The tombs, the painted mummies, the rituals of preservation, all the care taken over centuries could not forestall the sweeping tides of history. Even Cleopatra's tomb, shrouded in mystery, carries an ironic echo of the Ptolemaic obsession with appearances. Whether hidden beneath a temple at Taposiris Magna or lost to the sands, the resting place of one of history's most fascinating figures remains elusive. It's as though the dynasty's final lesson was this: all the pomp, all the careful planning, all the dynastic manipulation ultimately leaves behind traces, but not certainty. And yet, in reflecting on Cleopatra's life, there is a quiet satisfaction in the details. Her intelligence, her adaptability, and her ability to navigate a world of fragile relatives, complex alliances, and constant threats are remarkable. She survived longer than many of her siblings and managed to leave a mark on history far beyond her small corner of the Nile. Her life, full of irony, fragility, and occasional triumph, exemplifies the strange mix of brilliance and vulnerability that characterized the Ptolemies. So as we drift through these final years, let's picture Alexandria in the warm glow of sunset. The palaces are quiet, the markets are slowly emptying, and Cleopatra, aware of both her power and her mortality, moves through her city with calm, deliberate grace. Her family's eccentricities, the consequences of inbreeding, and the fragile web of alliances all hang in the air like a soft, persistent hum, a reminder that even in a world of gold and grandeur, human frailty remains ever present. And now, as we prepare to drift gently toward the concluding reflections on Cleopatra, her dynasty, and the enduring fascination of her life, we can appreciate the quiet, almost hypnotic rhythm of history itself. Fragile lives, delicate power, and the strange, ironic persistence of family patterns that echo across centuries.
The last echoes of the Ptolemies. Tombs, mummies, and lingering legacies. As we continue our gentle journey through history, let's drift toward the quieter aftermath of Cleopatra's reign. The Ptolemaic dynasty, so vibrant, chaotic, and often tragic, was now at an end. The city of Alexandria remained, its streets alive with scholars, traders, and the ebb and flow of the Nile. But the family that had shaped it for centuries was gone. There is something softly melancholic about the way the dynasty concluded. After Cleopatra and Caesarion, the line of Greek pharaohs disappeared. Rome absorbed Egypt, yet the echoes of centuries of royal eccentricity lingered. Tombs that once held painted mummies and elaborate treasures became silent witnesses to lives once filled with ambition, rivalry, and strange domestic dramas. Speaking of tombs, let's imagine them quietly. Some were likely ornate, filled with gold, jewels, and ritual objects. Others may have been simpler, perhaps hastily arranged in times of crisis. Mummies were often wrapped meticulously in linen, coated in resins, and painted with symbolic colors. Some ancient sources suggest pigments were applied while the body was still warm, an odd, almost theatrical gesture intended to preserve vitality in the afterlife. In a dynasty obsessed with appearances and lineage, these tombs were both memorial and statement, a silent insistence that identity could endure even when mortality could not. And yet, for all the care, these resting places could not protect against time, looters, or the relentless shifts of history. Tombs were disturbed, artifacts scattered, and details lost to sand, water, and human curiosity. The physical traces of the Ptolemies now exist mostly as fragments: a painted coffin here, a statue there, a coin bearing the face of a long-dead ruler who looked slightly like a confused turnip, if the historians are to be believed. It's worth reflecting on the peculiar mix of fragility and ambition that defines the dynasty. Siblings married siblings, children were often frail, and political struggles were constant. Yet amid these challenges, the Ptolemies produced a civilization of remarkable cultural richness. Alexandria's libraries, its schools of philosophy, its temples, and its art all bore witness to a dynasty that, despite its internal chaos, contributed significantly to human knowledge and culture. Consider, too, the more subtle eccentricities. Royal children often grew up under strict tutelage, learning languages, philosophy, and politics from a very young age. But the pressures of inbreeding, delicate health, and political expectation meant that even minor illness could have significant consequences. Childhood for a Ptolemaic prince or princess was both an education in governance and a subtle rehearsal for survival in a dangerous, highly performative family environment. And what of Cleopatra herself, now resting, wherever her tomb may lie? The accounts of her death, whether by self-administered venom or another method, are quiet, deliberate, and almost ritualistic. Her life, full of intrigue, intelligence, and careful calculation, ended in a manner consistent with the patterns that had defined her entire reign: subtle, strategic, and imbued with a sense of controlled dignity. The dynasty's remaining traces, painted mummies, fragments of temples, coins, and scattered inscriptions, are reminders of both ambition and fragility. They hint at family rivalries, sibling marriages, and political machinations, yet they also whisper of the human lives behind the spectacle. Fragile bodies, clever minds, and delicate negotiations shaped a civilization as much as armies, battles, and decrees did. As we drift through this quiet landscape, it's helpful to imagine Alexandria in those final moments. Palaces now silent, markets less crowded, scholars still at work, and the Nile flowing endlessly, indifferent to the fate of kings and queens. The Ptolemies are gone, yet the traces of their peculiar brilliance and domestic chaos remain, almost like a faint hum beneath the city's surface. And then there are the smaller, almost overlooked details. The everyday eccentricities, a queen's obsession with image, a prince's tendency to illness, a sibling feud simmering quietly for years, or a ceremonial banquet gone slightly awry. These are the human moments that make history feel alive in a quiet, hypnotic way, more relaxing and absorbing than any dramatic battle scene. And finally, consider the dynasty as a study of contrasts. They were brilliant and fragile, cunning and petty, theatrical and meticulous. Every generation seemed to repeat the same mistakes: sibling marriages, fragile heirs, early deaths, and rivalry. Yet each also produced moments of extraordinary intelligence, diplomacy, and cultural achievement. Cleopatra's life, with all its romance, strategy, and eventual tragedy, encapsulates these contradictions beautifully. And so, as we drift toward the conclusion of our exploration, we can sit quietly with these reflections. The calm corridors of Alexandria, the faint scent of incense in deserted temples, the painted mummies resting in shadowed tombs, and the persistent echo of a dynasty obsessed with lineage, image, and survival. In all of this, there is a slow, soothing rhythm, a dynasty rising and falling, human frailty pressing against ambition, and the quiet inevitability of time. History, in the end, is not just battles or conquests. It is these subtle patterns, the gentle repetition of folly and brilliance, the fragile balance of life and legacy. The Ptolemies remind us that even in grandeur, In dynasties filled with gold and titles, human concerns remain quietly, persistently present. The health of children, the ambitions of siblings, the careful orchestration of appearances, and the delicate negotiation between life and death. And as we slowly let our minds drift away from the bustling palaces, the painted mummies, and the fragile airs of Egypt, we can take comfort in the rhythms of history itself, a gentle, repetitive dance of ambition, vulnerability, and quiet, enduring fascination.
Rediscovering Cleopatra: Myths, Tombs, and Modern Fascination. Now, as we continue this slow journey, let's drift from the ancient world into the quiet, persistent echoes of Cleopatra's legacy. While her dynasty has long vanished, the fascination with her life continues to ripple across centuries. Scholars, artists, and storytellers have returned repeatedly to her story, each time adding layers of interpretation, legend, and speculation. It is remarkable, in a softly ironic way, how much of what we know about Cleopatra is a mixture of historical fact and imaginative elaboration. Roman writers, naturally, were not impartial observers. To them, she was clever, alluring, dangerous, a woman who had beguiled powerful men and threatened the Roman order. Their accounts are full of admiration, exaggeration, and the occasional polite exaggeration that borders on outright slander. Centuries later, artists and historians reconstructed her image according to contemporary tastes, from the dramatic gowns and heavy eyeliner of Hollywood to the subtle, idealized coins in statues of antiquity. Some portray her as a scheming seductress, others as a brilliant strategist. Yet the reality, quietly observed, was far more nuanced. Cleopatra was a ruler, a diplomat, a mother, and a figure navigating the precarious currents of a dynastic and political world. The myths, while compelling, are only the soft surface of a far more complex story. Archaeology, too, has added its whispers to this tale. Excavations at Alexandria, Taposiris Magna, and other sites have uncovered traces of temples, artifacts, and inscriptions that hint at her reign. Painted mummies, fragmentary sarcophagi, and fragments of statues offer small, tantalizing glimpses into a world that was both magnificent and deeply human. Some historians even claim glimpses of her burial site may survive beneath the shifting sands, although, like much in Egypt, the evidence is fragmentary, elusive, and tinged with poetic mystery. Consider, too, the persistent fascination with her tombs and mummies. Scholars debate whether the Ptolemies' painted mummies were intended to preserve vitality, display divine status, or merely impress future generations. The act of painting, wrapping, and ritual preservation was a delicate, almost hypnotic process, requiring patience, artistry, and care. One imagines artisans quietly applying pigments, carefully wrapping linen, and performing rituals designed to freeze a fleeting human life into something enduring. And yet, as with much of the Ptolemaic line, time, neglect, and the impermanence of human endeavors intervene. Tombs are lost, sarcophagi broken, and painted mummies fade. All the careful preservation cannot entirely resist the slow pull of centuries. There is a quiet, almost melancholic beauty in this. The dynasty's desire for permanence, the human need to leave a mark, and the inevitable fading of even the most brilliant life. Modern fascination with Cleopatra is not just academic. Literature, theater, and film have all returned to her story again and again. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects, her beauty, her intelligence, her political skill, but all share a gentle undercurrent of irony. The more we try to fix her image in our minds, the more elusive the real person becomes. Cleopatra was, like all humans, complex, contradictory, and subtly flawed. And perhaps that is why her story endures, quietly, across millennia. There are lessons in the smaller details as well. The repeated inbreeding of the Ptolemies, the fragile health of heirs, and the internal rivalries all resonate quietly with modern observers. These patterns remind us that power, for all its grandeur, is fragile. Dynasties rise and fall, ambitious individuals exert influence, and yet human frailty, health, mortality, and family complexity remains ever present, quietly shaping the course of history. It is also worth noting the subtler, quieter ironies. Cleopatra, who managed to survive the chaos of her family and the ambitions of Rome, still could not protect her son, Caesarion. The dynasty's final echo was one of tragic inevitability. All the brilliance, charm, and intelligence of centuries of rulers could not resist the forces of empire and time. And yet, in that very fragility lies fascination. As we drift through these reflections, we might picture modern Alexandria, archaeologists brushing away sand, historians pondering fragments of coins and inscriptions, and tourists walking slowly past ruins. The echoes of Cleopatra's world are still faintly present, in the architecture, in the lingering Nile breeze, and in the imagination of those who pause to consider a queen who lived, loved, schemed, and endured amidst fragile family lines and political turbulence. And so we can drift a little further, imagining the smaller details that often go unnoticed. The quiet gestures of daily life in the royal court, the careful management of correspondence, the negotiation of grain shipments, the subtle orchestration of ceremonies, and the gentle rituals that preserved both dignity and order. These everyday acts, mundane by themselves, collectively shaped a world that was at once fragile, brilliant, and enduring. The Ptolemies remind us that history is rarely composed of grand gestures alone. It is also the sum of small decisions, family dynamics, fragile bodies, and subtle negotiations. In their lives we see ambition tempered by vulnerability, intelligence shadowed by mortality, and strategy mingled with human folly. Cleopatra's life, in particular, exemplifies this interplay, a ruler whose brilliance was amplified by the precariousness of her family and the fragility of her era. And as we slowly let these reflections settle, it becomes clear why Cleopatra continues to captivate our imaginations. Her life was an interplay of ambition and charm, intellect and risk, spectacle and subtlety. It was, quietly, a life fully human, full of small ironies, fragile triumphs, and persistent echoes of her family's peculiar patterns. In the end, the Ptolemaic dynasty and Cleopatra herself leave us with a gentle, hypnotic rhythm, a slow dance of fragile power, eccentric family dynamics, and the quiet persistence of human memory. And as we drift toward sleep, perhaps we can carry with us these echoes of ancient Alexandria. The shimmer of gold, the painted mummies, the delicate rivalry of siblings, and the enduring fascination of a queen who, despite all odds, left a mark that centuries cannot erase.
Cleopatra's cultural legacy, lessons from the Ptolemies. As we continue to meander softly through history, let's consider the quieter, subtler aspects of Cleopatra's legacy. Beyond battles, alliances, and royal intrigue, there is a cultural resonance that has endured for nearly 2 millennia. Alexandria, her city, stands as a symbol of knowledge, ambition, and the strange human desire to balance grandeur with fragile humanity. Cleopatra was, in many ways, an embodiment of her city. Alexandria was vibrant, cosmopolitan, and intellectually alive. Scholars studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Merchants traded goods from the far reaches of the known world. Temples shimmered with devotion, gold, and ritual. And within this context, Cleopatra ruled with a careful attention to both politics and culture. She sponsored building projects, encouraged learning, and understood that her image, her very presence, was part of a larger, enduring narrative. There is something quietly ironic here. The dynasty that so often stumbled in its internal affairs, that repeatedly produced fragile heirs and ill-fated rulers, nonetheless fostered a cultural environment of remarkable sophistication. Ambition, fragility, and intellect coexisted uneasily in the Ptolemaic world. Cleopatra herself navigated this tension with subtle brilliance, aware that her political survival depended on charm, intelligence, and the careful orchestration of her public persona. And then there is the broader historical fascination. Writers, artists, and historians have returned to Cleopatra again and again, not just for her beauty or her alliances, but because her life embodies contrasts, power and vulnerability, cunning and fragility, spectacle and subtlety. The Ptolemaic dynasty, despite all its internal chaos, continues to intrigue because it mirrors the human condition so closely. We seek control, yet we are vulnerable. We strive for legacy, yet we cannot fully escape mortality. Let's also consider the lessons from the smaller details. The repeated inbreeding of the dynasty, while politically motivated, led to fragile heirs and unpredictable outcomes. Sibling rivalries, fragile alliances, and early deaths shaped not only the personal lives of rulers, but the course of history itself. These quiet patterns, repeated across generations, are as hypnotic as they are instructive. Power, like life, is fragile, and even the most meticulous planning cannot fully counteract human vulnerability. There is also Cleopatra's personal subtlety. She understood optics in a way that few rulers did. Coins, statues, and public appearances were carefully orchestrated to project intelligence, divinity, and authority. Her ability to communicate across languages, to navigate complex Roman politics, and to maintain her position amid constant threats reflects a mind attuned to both the overt and the quiet mechanisms of influence. And yet, beneath the grandeur, there were persistent reminders of human fragility. The early deaths of siblings, the delicate health of children, and the recurring failures of relatives all underscore the limits of power. The dynasty's obsession with appearances, painted mummies, lavish tombs, and ceremonial pomp was in many ways an effort to impose order on a world that remained, quietly and persistently, unpredictable. As we drift further, we might reflect on the subtler human elements. Cleopatra negotiating grain shipments, overseeing the education of her children, or quietly reading letters in the palace gardens. Even amid political maneuvering, there were these intimate moments of daily life, small acts of agency and management that remind us she was human, not merely an icon of history. It is also quietly fascinating to consider the dynasty's enduring fascination in the modern imagination. Cleopatra has inspired art, literature, film, and scholarship, each interpretation layering new meaning onto her life. And yet these interpretations always grapple with the same tension, the interplay of ambition and fragility, power and vulnerability, spectacle and human subtlety. In many ways, the Ptolemaic story is a meditation on the rhythms of human life. Generations of rulers,
fragile bodies, and eccentric family dynamics create a slow, almost hypnotic pattern. Ambition and intelligence, cunning and vulnerability, all interweave into a narrative that endures not just because of dramatic battles alone, but because of the persistent, quietly ironic patterns of human behavior. As we imagine Alexandria, perhaps we can picture scholars moving through the libraries, artisans working quietly in temples, and the lingering echoes of the Ptolemaics in the painted mummies and fragmented statues. History, in these quiet traces, becomes almost meditative. Fragile power, subtle strategy, and the slow passage of time. And finally, as we consider Cleopatra's legacy, we can note the gentle irony of her enduring fame. She outlived most of her siblings, navigated a complex and dangerous world, and yet her life is remembered largely through stories, interpretations, and fragmented evidence. She remains, softly, a figure both historical and mythical, a testament to intelligence, subtlety, and the quiet persistence of human fascination. In the end, the Ptolemaic dynasty, despite its fragility, its eccentricities, and its repeated patterns of misfortune, left a remarkable legacy. Culture, scholarship, and memory endure, even when tombs are lost, dynasties fall, and human lives pass away. And Cleopatra, quietly, stands at the center of this story, a life both extraordinary and in its daily details profoundly human. So, as we drift ever gently through history tonight, we can carry with us these echoes, the painted mummies, the fragile heirs, the sibling rivalries, and the persistent, quiet fascination that centuries of observers have found in Alexandria. And in these echoes, perhaps there is a calm rhythm, human lives, ambition, fragility, and the quiet, hypnotic passage of history itself.
Lesser-known Ptolemies, eccentricities, and quiet ironies. As we continue our slow wander through the corridors of history, let's turn to the lesser-known members of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Cleopatra often dominates our imagination, but her extended family was filled with characters whose lives were quietly fascinating, odd, and sometimes tragically humorous. Take Ptolemy VI Philometor, for instance, Cleopatra's great-uncle and one of the more long-lived Ptolemies. His nickname, Philometor, means mother-loving, which seems polite until you realize he was entangled in the kind of family politics that might have made anyone cling to their mother for comfort. He ascended to the throne as a child, which, in this dynasty, was an almost guaranteed recipe for chaos. Advisors, relatives, and opportunistic generals all circled like vultures, each hoping to direct the child king toward decisions that suited themselves. Ptolemy VI survived these early threats, but not without a lifetime of navigating petty rivalries and ceremonial absurdities. Then there's Ptolemy VIII Euergeses II, sometimes called Physcon, meaning the potbelly. He is remembered not for strategic brilliance, but for being a particularly difficult, vindictive, and eccentric ruler. He married his own sister, Cleopatra II, naturally, and the marriage was as stormy as one might expect. Family dinners likely involved more scheming than conversation, and historians quietly note his tendency toward paranoia and cruelty. Yet despite his flaws, he maintained power, demonstrating that eccentricity and ruthlessness were sometimes more valuable than wisdom or compassion. The Ptolemaic sisters themselves also add a layer of quiet absurdity. Cleopatra II, Cleopatra III, and Cleopatra IV each navigated marriages to brothers, nephews, or cousins, creating alliances that were as confusing to outsiders as they were politically necessary. Rivalries simmered, and exiles or executions were not uncommon. Their lives were punctuated by carefully orchestrated appearances, political maneuvering, and in some cases, subtle cruelty. A reminder that, in this dynasty,
Charm and ruthlessness were often two sides of the same coin. One can imagine the quieter, almost comical domestic scenes, a sibling sneaking into a palace chamber to discuss an inheritance, a prince fretting over ceremonial robes, or a queen rolling her eyes at another politically arranged marriage. These are not the battles recorded in textbooks, but they are the rhythm of daily life in a dynasty obsessed with lineage, appearances, and the subtle management of human behavior. And then there were the children. The Ptolemaics produced heirs who were often frail, sickly, or temperamentally peculiar. Some were rumored to have minor deformities, unusual habits, or striking eccentricities. Childhood in these royal households was less about innocence and more about training in diplomacy, etiquette, and survival. Tutors were strict, health crises were frequent, and even minor misbehavior could have significant political consequences. It is a testament to the resilience of some individuals that they survived long enough to influence events, and an equal testament to the fragility of others who did not. Even the ceremonial aspects of the dynasty provide subtle fascination. Coronations, religious observances, and public appearances were meticulously planned, often designed to emphasize divinity, legitimacy, and the continuity of the dynasty. And yet behind the pomp, there were small, human concerns. Disagreements over seating arrangements, dietary preferences, or protocol. These details, almost invisible to history's broad strokes, reveal the Ptolemies as deeply human, caught between extraordinary privilege and the inevitabilities of mortality, health, and family complexity. The quieter ironies continue with the dynasty's end. After Cleopatra's death, the Roman Empire absorbed Egypt, yet many minor Ptolemies had already demonstrated that dynastic survival was never guaranteed. Fragile heirs, sibling rivalries, and unexpected deaths had slowly whittled down the family line, showing that the grand ambitions of a dynasty are often at the mercy of human frailty. There is also an enduring lesson in the subtle interplay of culture and power. The Ptolemies, despite eccentricities and personal flaws, fostered a civilization of remarkable cultural richness. Alexandria remained a hub of learning, trade, and religion. Even as rulers squabbled, married within the family, or plotted against each other, the city's cultural achievements persisted, quietly outlasting the fragile ambitions of its rulers. And so, as we drift through these reflections, it is worth noting the human rhythm of the Ptolemaic dynasty: ambition, fragility, eccentricity, and occasional brilliance. The family's peculiarities, repeated across generations, create a hypnotic pattern. Sibling marriages, fragile heirs, petty rivalries, and elaborate ceremonies form a tapestry that is both absurd and deeply human, reminding us that power is never as simple as it seems. As we imagine these lesser-known figures, it is easy to picture them in the quiet corners of palaces, negotiating alliances, fretting over health, or quietly observing the daily rituals of court life. Their stories are not dramatic battles or heroic conquests, but the subtle, persistent dance of power, family, and human limitation. And in that subtlety lies a gentle fascination, almost hypnotic in its rhythm. Even now, centuries later, we are drawn to these echoes. A ruler rolling her eyes at another ceremonial obligation, a prince nervously adjusting his robes, a sibling quietly plotting, or a child struggling with both expectation and frailty. These small, intimate details remind us that the lives of rulers are, at their core, human, fragile, idiosyncratic, and quietly ironic. And so, as we continue drifting through history tonight, we can carry with us the echoes of these lesser-known Ptolemies, eccentric, fragile, ambitious, and endlessly human. They remind us that history is not merely a series of grand events, but a slow, hypnotic tapestry of personality, circumstance, and the quiet rhythms of life.
The last generations of the Ptolemies, fragility, irony,
and the fall of a dynasty. As we continue our slow meander through the corridors of history, let's turn our attention to the final generations of the Ptolemaic dynasty. By now, centuries of inbreeding, sibling marriages, and fragile heirs had created a lineage that was both brilliant and precarious, a family whose very survival seemed suspended by delicate threads. Following Cleopatra VII and Caesarion, the dynasty's remaining members were largely figureheads, overshadowed by the expanding power of Rome. Octavian's triumph over Antony and Cleopatra solidified Egypt as a Roman province, but the echoes of Ptolemaic eccentricity and ambition persisted in quieter ways. Even in exile or marginal roles, these last Ptolemies carried with them the heavy, inherited weight of family patterns, rivalries, fragile health, and subtle intrigues. Take, for example, the minor princes and princesses who survived Cleopatra's fall. Many were quickly absorbed into the Roman system, either removed from power or married into other dynasties to neutralize potential claims. Their lives, once filled with grandeur, became quietly circumscribed. One can imagine them navigating a world of polite constraint, performing carefully for Roman overseers, and carrying the invisible burden of a family that had once ruled an empire. There is a subtle irony here. For centuries, the Ptolemies had meticulously managed appearances, lineage, and public image. They had painted mummies, staged ceremonies, and orchestrated marriages designed to maintain both power and purity. Yet the family's survival depended not on clever maneuvering or divine ritual, but on the whims of external powers, Rome in this case, and on the fragile persistence of their own bodies. Ambition, it seems, could only go so far against the inexorable tide of history. Even among these final generations, quirks and eccentricities persisted. Fragile heirs, nervous princes, and ambitious but powerless siblings carried the DNA of centuries of inbreeding. Some had minor deformities or unusual habits. Others struggled with temperament or health. These traits, seemingly trivial in a family of rulers, could become significant under the pressures of dynastic expectation. It's almost hypnotic to observe how the same patterns, marriage within the family, fragile offspring, subtle rivalries, repeat themselves generation after generation like a slow, inexorable rhythm. There were also quieter tragedies. Children who survived infancy often faced short lives or limited influence. Siblings who might have supported one another became rivals instead. And yet, amidst this fragility, there were occasional sparks of brilliance, a carefully negotiated marriage, a subtle political move, or a minor prince who survived long enough to witness the continuing story of Egypt under Roman rule. These small successes, almost imperceptible, stand out against the backdrop of systemic vulnerability. And then there is the collapse itself, which is both inevitable and quietly ironic. The Ptolemies had survived centuries of internal turmoil, sibling rivalries, and fragile heirs, only to be swept aside by a far more powerful external force. Rome, distant and methodical, required little personal vendetta. The dynasty's carefully orchestrated patterns of survival were ultimately insufficient. The fall of the last Ptolemies is less a story of dramatic defeat and more a gentle, inexorable fading, a slow, quiet reminder that even dynasties built on intelligence, cunning, and charm are vulnerable to forces beyond their control. Yet even in this fading there is fascination. The last Ptolemies remind us that history is not solely about the grand gestures of conquest or the brilliance of individual rulers. It is also about fragility, family patterns, and the subtle interplay of ambition, human limitation, and circumstance. Every minor prince or princess, every fragile heir, every quiet marriage negotiation contributes to the rhythm of history in ways that are both hypnotic and quietly instructive.
We can also reflect on Alexandria itself, the city that bore witness to centuries of Ptolemaic rule. Palaces may have fallen silent, temples may have been repurposed for other things, and tombs may have been lost to time, but the cultural and intellectual legacy persisted. Scholars continued their work, traders continued to exchange goods, and the Nile flowed unchanged. The grandeur of the dynasty, fragile though it was, left subtle, persistent traces that continued to shape the world long after the last Ptolemy passed. And as we drift through these reflections, it is worth pausing to consider the gentle ironies that accompany dynastic life. Ambition, intelligence, and careful strategy can only go so far in the face of fragile bodies, rival siblings, and the unpredictable whims of history. Painted mummies, ceremonial pomp, and carefully orchestrated marriages were all attempts to impose order, continuity, and dignity on lives that remained deeply human and inherently vulnerable. The last generations of the Ptolemies, then, are not merely footnotes in history. They are reminders of the delicate interplay between ambition and fragility, intelligence and circumstance, human agency, and the inexorable forces of time. In observing their lives, we see patterns repeated, mistakes echoed, and small triumphs quietly persisting amid inevitable decline. And so, as we drift ever more gently toward the conclusion of our exploration, we can imagine the last Ptolemies in Alexandria, quiet corridors, whispered conversations, fragile airs tending to delicate rituals, and the persistent hum of a dynasty that, despite its end, leaves traces in every stone, inscription, and artifact. The rhythm of history, after all, is not only in victories or conquests, it is in the subtle, persistent patterns of human life, ambition, and mortality. The fall of the dynasty is, in this light, almost soothing to reflect upon. There is no sudden catastrophe, only the gradual ebb of a family that had endured both brilliance and fragility. It is a reminder that history's fascination often lies not in spectacle, but in quiet persistence, subtle patterns, and the enduring traces of human life.
Cultural echoes, architecture, artifacts, and the mysteries of the Ptolemies. As we continue to drift softly through history, let's turn our attention to the quieter, enduring traces of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Beyond the lives of rulers and the intricacies of family intrigue, there is a legacy etched into stone, preserved in artifacts, and whispered through architectural remains. Alexandria and its surroundings still carry these subtle echoes, even millennia later. Palaces once filled with ceremonial grandeur now exist largely as foundations, fragments, and shadows. The walls, once adorned with colorful frescoes depicting gods, royalty, and symbolic narratives, remind us of a civilization that carefully orchestrated image, ritual, and spectacle. Even the smallest decorative details, the painted reliefs, the gilded accents, and the intricate mosaics offer quiet insights into the tastes, priorities, and ambitions of rulers who understood that perception mattered as much as reality. And then there are the artifacts. Coins bearing the faces of Ptolemaic rulers, often idealized, provide a glimpse of both self-perception and propaganda. Sculptures, statues, and reliefs reflect attempts to balance Hellenistic traditions with Egyptian symbolism, a visual language designed to convey legitimacy, divinity, and authority. In many cases, the contrast is almost hypnotic, rulers appearing both human and godlike, fragile and enduring, caught between two worlds and centuries of expectation. Even everyday objects, quietly preserved, carry the rhythm of life in Ptolemaic Egypt. Pottery, tools,
jewelry, and inscriptions remind us that the dynasty was not just about ceremonial display, but also about daily management of economy, religion, and administration. Cleopatra herself, with her attention to detail, likely oversaw the creation and use of such objects, understanding that culture, commerce, and perception were inseparable from rulership. And yet, for all this meticulous preservation, much remains mysterious. The precise location of Cleopatra's tomb, for instance, continues to elude archaeologists. Some believe it lies beneath a temple at Taposiris Magna, quietly hidden beneath centuries of sand and debris. Others suspect it may be lost entirely to time. The uncertainty itself is almost soothing in a reflective way. It allows the imagination to wander through the possibilities, considering a queen who lived fully, strategically, and yet leaves traces that are tantalizingly incomplete. Architecture, too, carries the quiet echoes of ambition and fragility. Temples in public buildings, now in ruins, were once sites of both ceremonial importance and practical administration. Their orientation, decoration, and placement reflected careful thought, ritual significance, and the subtle assertion of authority. Walking through these spaces today, one can almost sense the hushed deliberations of planners, artisans, and rulers as they work to project power while accommodating human limitations. The Ptolemies' cultural legacy also includes libraries, some of which may have influenced or rivaled the Great Library of Alexandria. These centers of learning collected texts on medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and law. Even in fragments, these works reveal a civilization that valued knowledge, debate, and the systematic recording of human understanding. Cleopatra herself was reputedly multilingual, intellectually curious, and strategically astute, a ruler shaped as much by culture as by circumstance. And so, the artifacts, architecture, and texts all contribute to a gentle, hypnotic pattern, a dynasty that understood both the fragility of life and the enduring power of human creativity. They remind us that history is not only about battles or dynastic drama, but also about subtle accomplishments, cultural refinement, and the slow accumulation of human knowledge. There is also the quiet irony of rediscovery. Many Ptolemaic artifacts were lost, stolen, or fragmented over centuries. European collectors, archaeologists, and treasure hunters have pieced together fragments of a civilization, often reconstructing images of Cleopatra, her family, and her city from the smallest shards. In doing so, modern observers encounter the same tension her dynasty faced, trying to impose order and understanding on a world that is inherently fragmented, fragile, and enigmatic. And then there is the rhythm of mortality and memory. Painted mummies, elaborately decorated tombs, and inscriptions were all attempts to defy impermanence. Yet time moves inexorably. The delicate linen of mummies decays, frescoes fade, and buildings crumble. What remains is the faint pulse of human ambition and creativity, like a whisper across centuries, reminding us that even in impermanence, beauty and intention persist. And finally, as we drift through these reflections, we can consider the subtle, almost meditative lessons of the Ptolemies. Fragility and ambition coexist. Human life is layered with complexity, and the traces of culture, art, and intellect endure even when dynasties collapse. Cleopatra's Egypt, with all its contradictions, eccentricities, and careful orchestration, is an enduring testament to the interplay of human genius, vulnerability, and subtle persistence. And as we let these echoes settle, We can imagine Alexandria once more. Scholars quietly copying texts, artisans carefully applying paint to reliefs, priests conducting soft rituals in fading temples, and the Nile flowing steadily, indifferent, yet witness to centuries of human life. In these quiet images, history becomes meditative, a rhythm of ambition, fragility, and subtle genius that persists long after the last Ptolemaic ruler has passed.
Whispered mysteries and lesser-known anecdotes, the human side of the Ptolemies. As we continue this slow journey through history, let's linger on the quieter, more intimate corners of Ptolemaic life. Beyond tombs, battles, and political maneuvers, there is a wealth of subtle human stories, small, ironic, sometimes absurd, that reveal the personalities and daily rhythms of this fascinating dynasty. Consider the minor Ptolemies whose lives rarely appear in history books. Princes and princesses, often overshadowed by Cleopatra or her siblings, carried the weight of dynastic expectation. Some were unusually fragile, plagued by illness or temperament, and yet were expected to navigate complex ceremonial duties, diplomatic negotiations, and family rivalries. The sheer mental load, combined with their delicate health, must have created a kind of quiet tension that historians can only guess at. Imagine a young prince, perhaps prone to fainting, carefully balancing a ceremonial crown while cousins whispered behind curtains about inheritance. It's a small human tableau of fragility, ambition, and subtle absurdity. And then there are the strange personal habits of some rulers. Historical sources note minor obsessions, ritualistic behaviors, peculiar dress, or eccentric preferences in food and seating. Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Physcon, was reportedly particularly cruel and capricious, yet even he had moments of almost comical domesticity, attending banquets with precise expectations or micromanaging palace arrangements. These quirks, while irritating to courtiers, also reveal that these figures were human, complicated, vulnerable, and sometimes strangely whimsical. Sibling rivalries, of course, remain central to the dynasty's rhythm. Ptolemies frequently married their own siblings, creating tangled webs of affection, obligation, and resentment. Power was perpetually contested behind closed doors, and marriages were often political theater more than anything else. One can imagine whispered schemes, quietly sabotaged ceremonies, or subtle gestures of dominance and defiance, all performed under the veneer of public ritual. These small dramas, though minor in scale, reveal a pattern of life that is human and strangely timeless, ambition and fragility intertwined in endlessly repeating rhythms. And yet, amidst all this fragility, there were moments of brilliance. Cleopatra's strategic acumen, linguistic skill, and ability to navigate Roman politics reflect the subtle genius present in even the most challenging circumstances. Similarly, minor Ptolemies occasionally managed diplomatic negotiations, oversaw building projects, or demonstrated unexpected resilience. These small victories, quietly woven into the broader tapestry of dynastic life, illustrate the persistent interplay between human limitation and achievement. And finally, there are lingering mysteries that continue to captivate historians. Cleopatra's tomb, the precise locations of many royal burials, and fragments of ceremonial texts remain tantalizingly elusive. The gaps in evidence allow the imagination to wander, imagining the private lives, small triumphs, and intimate frustrations of rulers whose lives were largely governed by circumstance. There is a gentle rhythm in this uncertainty. Even centuries later, the dynasty whispers to us through fragments, artifacts, and shadows, inviting reflection rather than spectacle. And so, as we drift through these reflections tonight, we can imagine the quieter moments, a prince quietly adjusting his ceremonial robes,
a sibling murmuring strategies behind closed doors, artisans carefully painting mummies, or Cleopatra herself, observing, calculating, and managing her family's fragile yet enduring presence. These intimate details, understated yet persistent, form a hypnotic cadence, an echo of humanity, ambition, and the inevitable fragility of life. The Ptolemaic dynasty, in its eccentricities, rivalries, and carefully orchestrated life and death, reminds us that history's fascination often lies not in dramatic battles or monumental conquests, but in subtle patterns, small ironies, and the quiet persistence of human behavior. In these whispers of Alexandria, in painted mummies and in fragmented texts, we find both fragility and brilliance, human folly and intelligence, carefully orchestrated ambition and inevitable mortality. And as we let these echoes settle, we drift gently through the quiet corridors of memory, feeling the slow rhythm of history, ambition and fragility, brilliance and human limitation, repeated over centuries, quietly shaping lives, legacies, and the persistent fascination of those who came after.
Reflections on Fragility and Legacy. Lessons from the Ptolemies. As we continue to drift softly through history, it is helpful to pause and consider the broader patterns and quiet lessons left by the Ptolemaic dynasty. Cleopatra, her siblings, and their extended family were not just rulers. They were humans navigating the fragile balance between ambition, mortality, and circumstance. Their stories offer subtle, hypnotic reflections that linger across centuries. First, the dynasty teaches us about fragility. Children were often delicate, princes and princesses frequently sickly, and even the most capable rulers could be undone by minor illness, family strife, or an unlucky political move. In a family obsessed with lineage and appearances, these small vulnerabilities had outsized consequences. It is a quiet, sobering reminder that human life, no matter how privileged, remains subject to fragility and impermanence. Yet alongside this fragility, there was ambition, sometimes subtle, sometimes flamboyant. Cleopatra herself navigated the treacherous waters of Egyptian politics, Roman alliances, and family rivalries with remarkable intelligence. Even the lesser-known Ptolemies exercised agency within constraints, orchestrating ceremonies, negotiating marriages, and maintaining appearances. The rhythm of ambition in this dynasty was persistent, almost meditative, a quiet counterpoint to the ever-present fragility of life. There is also a hypnotic repetition in their history. Sibling marriages, minor deformities, fragile heirs, and petty rivalries recur across generations. Even as individual rulers rise or fall, the underlying patterns persist. This repetition is not dramatic. It is subtle, almost soothing in its predictability. We can observe the slow rhythm of dynastic life, noting how personality, circumstance, and inheritance interplay quietly over centuries. The dynasty's cultural achievements offer another layer of reflection. Alexandria remained a hub of scholarship, architecture, and art. Temples, libraries, and palaces, even when fragmentary, reveal a civilization attentive to beauty, intellect, and ritual. Cleopatra's reign in particular demonstrates the careful integration of governance, culture, and image management. There is a calm satisfaction in observing this interplay. Fragility does not preclude brilliance, and chaos does not erase enduring contributions to human knowledge and civilization. And yet, history has its quiet ironies. The Ptolemies meticulously preserved lineage and appearances, yet their dynasty fell not through spectacular conquest alone, but through a combination of internal fragility and external pressures. Their mummies, painted and preserved with care, remind us of the desire to impose permanence on impermanent lives. And in that effort, we find a subtle meditation. Humans seek control, legacy, and memory, even as mortality quietly asserts itself. Even the minor anecdotes, the eccentricities of Ptolemy VIII, the delicate health of minor princes, or sibling rivalries over trivial matters, offer a soft, hypnotic pattern. These details, almost invisible in grand histories, offer intimacy, irony, and the gentle rhythm of human life. History here becomes a slow, flowing meditation, more absorbing and calming than dramatic battles or political upheaval. Cleopatra herself, quietly observed, is emblematic of this rhythm. She balanced intelligence, charm, and strategy while navigating a fragile family and turbulent political world. Her life was a succession of subtle calculations, delicate negotiations, and quiet displays of power. Even in death, whether through ritual, legend, or historical speculation, she retains the balance of fragility and brilliance that defines the Ptolemaic experience. And so, as we drift further into reflection, we can imagine Alexandria one last time in this narrative. Scholars quietly copying texts in shaded libraries, artisans carefully applying pigments in near-empty temples, minor princes adjusting ceremonial robes, and queens managing subtle negotiations of power behind closed doors. The Nile flows endlessly, indifferent, yet a gentle witness to all these centuries of human ambition, folly, and persistence. Ultimately, the Ptolemies remind us that history's fascination is rarely about spectacle alone. It is about subtle patterns, human idiosyncrasy, fragile lives, and the quiet interplay of ambition and mortality. We observe, we reflect, and we drift with the rhythm of these centuries, finding both calm and hypnotic fascination in the echoes of a dynasty long past. And as we let this meditation settle, we can carry with us a gentle understanding. Brilliance and fragility coexist. Ambition and mortality are intertwined, and the quiet rhythms of human life, repeated, patterned, and endlessly subtle, offer a reflection of ourselves across time. The Ptolemies, in all their eccentricity, fragility, and ambition, are less a spectacle than a mirror, inviting slow, absorbing contemplation. So as we drift ever gently toward the end of this narrative tonight, we leave behind the painted mummies, the silent palaces, the fragile airs, and the subtle patterns of life and legacy. We take with us the quiet lesson that history's fascination often lies not in triumph or disaster, but in the gentle, persistent rhythm of human life, fragile, brilliant, and endlessly intriguing.
Modern fascination, rediscovery, myth, and the hypnotic echoes of Cleopatra. As we continue this slow journey through time, let us turn our attention to the ways Cleopatra and her dynasty have persisted in the modern imagination. Centuries may have passed since the last Ptolemaic ruler walked the halls of Alexandria, yet the allure of their story continues, quietly, like a gentle undercurrent beneath the surface of history. Cleopatra herself became naturally a symbol as much as a person. Artists, playwrights, filmmakers, and writers have returned to her life again and again, each adding layers of interpretation, embellishment, and sometimes outright fiction. In Shakespeare's plays, she is a dramatic, tragic figure. In Hollywood films, she becomes a glamorous icon, her life condensed into gestures, costumes, and dialogue. And yet, through all this reinvention, there remains a faint echo of the real woman, intelligent, strategic, multilingual, and profoundly aware of her fragile yet influential position in a male-dominated world. The enduring fascination with Cleopatra is also quietly ironic. Roman writers portrayed her as a seductress, dangerous and captivating, partly because that suited their political narrative. Coins and statues depict her with idealized features that may not have reflected her actual appearance. Over centuries, these images and stories accumulated, forming a mythos that is both compelling and incomplete. And perhaps therein lies part of the hypnotic fascination. Cleopatra is simultaneously real and imagined, historical and mythical, a figure we can reflect upon indefinitely without ever fully capturing. Archaeology has added subtle, almost meditative layers to this fascination. Excavations in Alexandria, Taposiris Magna, and elsewhere have uncovered fragments of temples, inscriptions, and artifacts that speak softly of a bygone era. Painted mummies, sarcophagi, coins, and jewelry all carry traces of intention, beauty, and human fragility. Even when incomplete or damaged, they allow us to imagine the daily life of a dynasty obsessed with lineage, image, and the delicate interplay of power and mortality. There is a quiet poetry in this rediscovery. Scholars brushing away sand, analyzing fragments, and carefully reconstructing details participate in a kind of dialogue with the past. Each artifact, each inscription, becomes a small connection across time, a whisper of human presence that transcends centuries. And in these moments, Cleopatra and the Ptolemies exist not merely as historical subjects, but as continuing participants in our reflections, inviting both fascination and contemplation. Modern culture also contributes to these echoes. Films, novels, and academic works continue to reframe Cleopatra's life, highlighting her intelligence, charm, or strategic skill. Yet even in exaggeration or embellishment, there is a persistent recognition of the subtle human rhythms that defined her life. Fragile heirs, eccentric family members, careful diplomacy, and the delicate management of perception. These patterns, repeated across centuries, provide a hypnotic, almost soothing rhythm for reflection. And then there are the enduring mysteries. Cleopatra's tomb has not been definitively located. Some scholars speculate it lies beneath a temple, hidden beneath centuries of sand and shifting ruins. Others suggest it may never be found. The ambiguity itself has a gentle, contemplative quality. It allows imagination to wander slowly through possibilities. A queen who lived fully, ruled strategically, and left behind traces that are tantalizingly incomplete. The absence of certainty is in a quiet way comforting, reminding us that history is not merely facts and dates, but also speculation, reflection, and slow discovery. Artifacts, inscriptions, and cultural memory together create a subtle, persistent rhythm. Ambition and fragility, brilliance and mortality, human ingenuity and the inevitability of time. The Ptolemaic cultural legacy, preserved in architecture, art, and scholarship, endures even when political power does not. Alexandria, once a hub of Hellenistic civilization, remains a site of reflection, reminding us that the influence of a dynasty can persist in intangible yet profound ways. We can also reflect on the small ironies that history preserves. Cleopatra, who survived sibling rivalries, fragile heirs, and the ambitions of Rome, remains remembered not merely for her life, but for the myths,
fragments, and artistic interpretations that followed. The dynasty's careful attention to image, lineage, and ceremony ultimately left traces more enduring than their fleeting political power. It is a quiet, subtle lesson in human persistence. Ambition, intelligence, and subtle artistry can outlast even dynasties themselves. And so, as we drift through these modern echoes, we can picture Alexandria one last time. Archaeologists gently uncovering fragments of temples, scholars studying coins in quiet libraries, artists imagining Cleopatra from subtle hints in historical evidence, and tourists walking slowly past ruins, sensing the faint rhythm of human life that has endured for millennia. It is in these small, almost imperceptible details that history's hypnotic power resides. The interplay of ambition, fragility, and cultural legacy, quietly persisting across centuries. The fascination with Cleopatra and her dynasty reminds us that history is not only a record of events, it is a meditation on human nature, ambition, vulnerability, and the patterns of life that repeat subtly over time. Painted mummies, fragmented artifacts, and enduring myths all contribute to a slow, reflective rhythm, a cadence that is as soothing as it is intellectually absorbing. And as we allow these reflections to settle gently, we can take from Cleopatra and the Ptolemies a quiet understanding that brilliance and fragility coexist, that ambition and mortality intertwine, and that even in impermanence, traces of human ingenuity, culture, and life persist. The dynasty, in its eccentricities, vulnerabilities, and subtle triumphs, offers a slow, meditative lesson on the persistence of human patterns and the hypnotic rhythm of history. So, as we drift toward the close of this story tonight, we leave behind Alexandria, the painted mummies, the fragile heirs, and the subtle traces of a dynasty long past. We carry with us instead the quiet fascination, gentle ironies, and hypnotic rhythms of human life, repeated, persistent, and endlessly intriguing.
Final reflections: the enduring rhythm of Cleopatra and the Ptolemies. As we drift softly toward the close of our journey tonight, it is worth pausing to reflect on the overarching patterns, quiet ironies, and enduring lessons left by Cleopatra and her dynasty. The Ptolemies, in all their ambition, eccentricity, and fragility, offer more than history. They provide a gentle meditation on human life itself. The dynasty teaches us first and foremost about fragility. Heirs were often delicate, rulers faced unpredictable mortality, and the smallest personal weakness could ripple into political consequence. Even Cleopatra, brilliant and strategic, was not immune to the limits of human life. And yet she navigated her world with remarkable intelligence and subtlety. In observing these patterns, we are reminded that no amount of power or planning can fully circumvent human vulnerability. Yet within this fragility, there is persistent ambition. The Ptolemies were constantly managing appearances, negotiating alliances, and orchestrating ceremonies, sometimes with genius, sometimes with eccentricity. Their lives were a slow, hypnotic rhythm of ambition counterbalanced by vulnerability, a delicate dance of power and mortality. The cadence of this pattern, repetition of sibling marriages, fragile heirs, and subtle rivalries, becomes almost meditative as we trace it across centuries. Cleopatra herself remains emblematic of this rhythm. Her intelligence, multilingualism, and strategic finesse allowed her to survive amidst chaos, to balance family rivalries, and to project an image of power and divinity. Yet beneath the surface, her life was also shaped by fragility, uncertainty, and human limitation. In her, we see the subtle interplay between agency and circumstance, ambition and vulnerability, brilliance and mortality. The dynasty's cultural contributions add another layer of reflection. Alexandria, with its libraries, temples, and palaces, preserved knowledge, art, and ritual, leaving echoes that persist even when political power has faded. Archaeological discoveries, fragmented artifacts, and enduring myths continue to whisper the story of the Ptolemies across time. These traces remind us that human creativity and cultural ambition often outlast individual lives, dynasties, and empires. There is also quiet, enduring irony. The Ptolemies meticulously curated images, mummies, and ceremonial practices to assert permanence and legitimacy. And yet, history preserves them not as a seamless record, but in fragments, in whispers, in myths, and in rediscovered artifacts. This partial preservation is perhaps more reflective of human life itself, ambitious, fragile, ephemeral, yet leaving traces that endure. The rhythm of the dynasty, repeated patterns of human behavior, subtle rivalries, and fragile lives echoes through centuries, quietly instructive and meditative. And even minor anecdotes, the eccentricities of Ptolemy VIII, the delicate health of lesser heirs, sibling rivalries over trivial matters, contribute to a hypnotic cadence. These small, intimate details invite us to pause, reflect, and observe the patterns of human life on a slow, absorbing scale. They offer an almost soothing rhythm, more calming than the grand narratives of conquest or tragedy. And as we reflect on Cleopatra and the final generations of the dynasty, we see the enduring human themes: ambition tempered by mortality, brilliance interwoven with vulnerability, and the quiet, persistent legacy of human creativity. The dynasty may have fallen, yet their cultural, intellectual, and symbolic traces endure like faint ripples on a vast, timeless river. In imagining Alexandria one last time tonight, we can picture scholars quietly copying texts, artisans carefully painting reliefs and mummies, rulers managing subtle negotiations of power, and the Nile flowing serenely beside them. Time moves on, empires rise and fall, yet these gentle rhythms of human life, ambition, and fragility remain, quietly instructive and hypnotically soothing. Ultimately, the Ptolemies and Cleopatra offer a meditation on the persistence of human life and culture. Brilliance coexists with fragility, ambition coexists with mortality, and subtle patterns repeat across generations. Observing these patterns gently reminds us that history is not only a series of dramatic events, but also a slow, hypnotic rhythm of human existence, one that is as calming as it is endlessly fascinating. And so, as we drift toward the final moments of this story, we leave behind the painted mummies, silent palaces, fragile heirs, and intricate family dramas. What remains is the quiet rhythm of ambition, vulnerability, and cultural legacy, a gentle echo of human life that persists across centuries, inviting reflection, contemplation, and perhaps a subtle, restful calm. The story of Cleopatra and the Ptolemies, in all its eccentricity, fragility, and intelligence, is not simply a tale of power or spectacle. It is a meditation on the delicate,
persistent and hypnotic patterns of human life, a rhythm that continues to whisper through history, through artifacts, through myth, and into our imagination tonight. And with that, we can let our thoughts drift softly, gently, and slowly, allowing the echoes of Alexandria, the Nile, and the Ptolemaic dynasty to settle in the mind, leaving a calm, reflective, and hypnotic sense of history's quiet persistence.
A gentle goodbye, the hypnotic lessons of Cleopatra and the Ptolemies. As we reach the final moments of our journey tonight, it is worth lingering for a few more gentle breaths in the quiet corridors of history. The story of Cleopatra and her dynasty is not simply about empires, battles, or fame. It is about the subtle, recurring rhythms of human life, fragility and ambition, brilliance and mortality, whimsy and careful orchestration. And in these rhythms, there is a hypnotic, soothing cadence, perfect for reflection and perhaps for sleep. The Ptolemies, in their eccentricities and obsessions, remind us that human life is often delicate and unpredictable. Fragile heirs, sibling rivalries, and minor eccentricities ripple outward, creating consequences that are sometimes profound, sometimes quietly absurd. Observing these patterns gently, without haste or drama, allows us to see history as a meditation rather than a race, as a reflection of humanity rather than a mere record of events. Cleopatra, in particular, embodies the balance between fragility and brilliance. Her intelligence, strategy, and cultural engagement allowed her to navigate perilous circumstances. Yet she remained human, subject to the same vulnerabilities and limitations as those around her. Through her life, we witness the slow interplay of human agency and circumstance, ambition and mortality, influence and impermanence. Even in death, the Ptolemies continue to whisper through the ages. Tombs, artifacts, inscriptions, and the faint echoes of Alexandria's streets offer fragments of their lives. Rediscovering these traces, contemplating the small quirks, rivalries, and domestic rhythms of the dynasty invites a gentle, hypnotic reflection. Each detail, an heir adjusting ceremonial robes, an artisan applying paint to a mummy, a scholar recording knowledge, becomes a soft pulse in the rhythm of human history. There is also a quiet lesson in impermanence. Despite meticulous planning, ceremonial displays, and careful attention to lineage, the Ptolemaic dynasty ultimately faded away. And yet in that fading, there is a persistent beauty, human ambition, cultural creativity, and the enduring fascination with life's patterns. The dynasty may no longer rule, but their echoes continue, quietly instructing and mesmerizing those who pause to listen. We can imagine Alexandria now as it once was, the Nile flowing steadily, indifferent yet observing, temples quietly witnessing rituals, scholars copying texts in shadowed rooms, rulers balancing subtle negotiations of power. And though centuries have passed, the rhythms remain, fragile, intricate, and hypnotically captivating. It is in these quiet patterns that the Ptolemies teach us about the gentle persistence of human life and legacy.